when you focus only on industrialization, you are focusing on profits and the bottom line and quarterly reports and commodities. I mean, I was raised with that term, commodity, everything, commodity reports, commodity markets, commodity, everything. We never thought of, as a wheat farmer, growing food. We're growing commodities, which is an industrial mindset. And that's what's led to so many problems, I think, in our food system, is not thinking of agriculture and farmers as growing food.
Welcome to the 361st installment of Ear to the Ground, the Land Stewardship Project's podcast on family farming, regenerative agriculture, community food systems, and local democracy. I'm Brian DeVore, editor of the Land Stewardship Letter. When Bob Quinn returned to his family's farming operation in the late 1970s, it was clear agriculture in this part of north central Montana looked very different compared to when he was growing up there in the 1950s and 60s. There were far fewer farms and ranches, and the remaining operations were larger, debt-ridden, and dependent on expensive inputs such as chemical fertilizers and pesticides. Even the 2,400 acres of land his family had at the time wasn't enough to support Bob and his family. This troubled the native Montanan. So Bob set out to develop agricultural enterprises that would not only support his family, but generate enough economic activity to support other families in the community of Big Sandy. One thing that became clear to him was that he needed to wean the land off its dependence on expensive chemical inputs to not only build healthier soil, but to keep more wealth local. I'd rather put $1 in my neighbor's pocket than send another dollar off to Monsanto, Quinn wrote in Grain by Grain, the 2019 book he co-authored with Liz Carlisle. During the past several decades, Bob has done just that. He's become a leader in organic crop production and developed value-added businesses, including one based on raising and processing an ancient variety of wheat. With all his enterprises, Bob's gauge of success isn't just based on his personal bottom line. He also considers how such a value-added enterprise can benefit other people living in his community and beyond. Over the years, he's helped numerous farmers get started raising regenerative products while building food-based enterprises that keep as much money local as possible. It's significant that one of the chapters in Bob's book is titled Bringing Rural Jobs Back. Bob's message of how regenerative farming can serve as the basis of rural economic revitalization is an important one, and is a key reason he was invited by the Land Stewardship Project to speak at a special small grains workshop in Albert Lea, Minnesota on January 28, 2025. Doubling down on raising more bushels for the undifferentiated commodity market isn't good for farmers or the communities they live in, argues Bob. We need to figure out ways agriculture can transition from an extractive to an additive presence in the community. Bob's commitment to regenerative agriculture and rural economic development is particularly striking given his academic and professional background. After leaving the Quinn family farm in the late 60s to attend college, he eventually received a doctorate in plant biochemistry. He worked for a time in an industry that preached the better living through chemistry mantra and generally bought into the industrial model of crop production. But somewhere along the line, Bob flipped his view of agriculture and the food it produces. As part of a 3-part series of podcasts focused on LSP's January 2025 Small Grains Workshop, I talked to Bob over Zoom about his journey toward a more regenerative approach to farming and why our industrialized food system isn't good for the land, the people, or our rural communities.
Well, I wasn't born organic, you see, and so I had no training in that. All my formative years, I went to local schools here in Big Sandy, went BOA classes, and I learned what they taught me. And when I went to Montana State University, it was the same. And when I went to UC Davis in California, it was the same. I studied what was being taught, and what was being taught mostly is yield is everything, and here's how you get it. You add all these chemicals, and you have a whiz-bang breeding program that can get you plants that can perform and respond to all those chemicals, so that gets you the highest yield possible. I had no reason to imagine anything was the matter with that idea. I mean, that's what everybody was doing. The first time I ever questioned it was actually in California when we were visiting a peach orchard, and the peaches on the tree, well, they looked ripe. Mm-hmm. They looked ripe, but they didn't smell ripe. And when we were allowed to taste one, they didn't taste ripe. They tasted green. They were terrible. Yeah. And the chemistry was that they had been sprayed with some type of petroleum product that changed the color to make them look ripe so they could be picked green and shipped clear across the country without damaging and bruising. And I thought, wow, that's like fraud.
Right.
Because I was used to getting peaches packaged in wooden boxes and individually wrapped, and they were delicious. I mean, you could smell them and everything. And then when we got to California, of course, we went to the orchard and picked them fresh off the tree. And the farmer would say, "Well, you want a can this afternoon or tomorrow?" And then he'd give us this pile or the other pile to go to, and they were just fabulous. And so that was my first awakening actually to industrial agriculture and what it was doing. I didn't really apply it to wheat farming because we're not growing peaches, and wheat is wheat, and
Right.
it doesn't really matter how you harvest it or anything like that. So I didn't really make the connection to that right away either. When I got back home, I got a little disillusioned with academia by then. It wasn't because of the chemistry, for much it was of the industrial building of the research laboratories. And it was all about competition between this lab and the other, where there's very little cooperation in those days. It was all about trying to beat the other guy in for the next grant. And so we were told not to tell anybody about what we were doing in our lab. In fact, might be in competition with us for the same money. When I got home, I left that track and came back to the farm and the ranch here in Montana. And it was 2,400 acres at the time, a little bit too small for two families to survive. It was just perfect for my folks, but my folks were still on the farm. So we had to figure out some way to add value to what we were doing or get a job in town, which I didn't want to do. And my wife we had three kids already and expecting another one pretty quick. And so she had more than a full-time job, and she helped me during harvest time and stuff. And I didn't want to send her to town and get a job. So we tried to figure out how we could add value to our crops, and we stumbled on to an opportunity to sell our high-protein wheat, which is what we grew here in northern Montana. The yields aren't great, but the protein is fantastic. Makes great bread. And we sold directly to whole grain bakers in Southern California. And that started in '83, about 5 years after we returned. Finally found a way to add value in 5 years. And so it wasn't easy. We tried several things that didn't work. But anyway, things went really well with this new customer. And then he called me up one day and he said, "You think you could get some organic grain for me? Same kind of quality you've been selling this." And I said, "Oh, sure." And I hung up the phone. I thought, "Oh my gosh, what did I just promise?" Because I didn't even know any organic farmers at that time. And I didn't even believe in this organic stuff because I've been taught all my life that a plant couldn't tell the difference between a molecule of nitrogen coming out of a manure pile and one coming out of a bag of ammonium sulfate. So I thought it was a bunch of hooey, from my scientific training. I mean, that's what we were taught.
Yeah, and 83, we didn't even have a national organic standard.
Oh no!
At the
And so I
time.
had to really scout around to find some organic farmers, and I finally found some in the northeast corner of Montana, but they were just a handful in the whole state in '84. This is '84 now, and but when I got acquainted with them, my customer loved their grain. We wrote out a little card that said it was organic because that's what we did in those days. There wasn't any certification required in California, just some kind of an affidavit. But anyway, I got acquainted with them, and there was a small group, and they invited me to their meetings. And my gosh, I found I had a whole new group of friends, and I was very intrigued with their stories that was all about how their farmland was changing, how they feel the difference in the tilth in their field, and how they can control weeds with rotations, and how they could grow their own fertilizers with legumes. And I was fascinated. As a scientist, I thought, wow, wouldn't it be fun to experiment on our own farm?
Yeah.
And that's really what I did, Brian. And that's how it started. And by '86, I was doing my own experimentation. And luckily, my experiments ran perfectly, and I was able to duplicate exactly the yield and the protein my father was receiving in a side-by-side comparison on a 20-acre patch of winter wheat in 1 year. And then the next year, we had grasshoppers, and I tried to control them on our chemical fields with malathion, which didn't work in the end. Well, it worked once, but we couldn't afford to spray it twice. And then compared to biological, I was using on my organic field, and the biological worked better than the chemical. And so at that point, I became a complete convert And just I haven't had a chemical in my place since '88. The last year we used chemicals, and it wasn't all easy, but that's how I was converted, and I never look back. I just look forward, and I'm so excited about trying to figure out how to really farm, follow what we see in nature and mimic what we see in nature and farm that way best we can.
That's really interesting background. Can you set the stage a little bit of what your agricultural system, agronomic and climate situation is there in northern Montana? What kind of precipitation are you getting? What kind of soils are you farming?
Oh, okay, sure. We are in the north central part of Montana, so we're east of the Rocky Mountains on the prairie. Montana has scattered, isolated mountain ranges, so we're between the Bear Paw Mountains, which is an isolated mountain range just sticking up out of the prairie, not a very big one, and the Missouri River breaks, which is also about 3 miles to the southeast of us, and the mountains are about 3 miles to the northwest. So that's where we're located. And it's the ground is all glacial till being brought in from Canada over the eons, 2 or 3 glacier ages, and so it's very rocky. We have a lot of stones. It's mostly sandy loam. It's quite fertile, and it grows great crops. We only have about 12 inches of rainfall and precipitation. 40% of that comes in May and June. So that's perfectly situated for small grains. And so this is mostly wheat country. And we're pretty close to the division between winter wheat and spring wheat, about 50 miles, maybe 80 miles north of us, to the Canadian border that's almost turns into exclusive spring wheat country. We're kind of in a mix, but about by 50 miles or 60 miles south of us, it's almost exclusively winter wheat country. So that's kind of where we are. And I was raised in a wheat and cattle ranch. We had 2,400 acres, 1,200 cultivated, and wheat and barley were our main crops. And the wheat was spring wheat or winter wheat, and the barley was feed barley. And that's what we did. And we raised little oats for the cows for feeding in the winter, and that was what we did. And that's what most of the neighbors did. And that's pretty much, it hasn't changed that much. We've got quite a few pulse crops now moving in, so people are looking at that. But generally, it's now no-till is very popular, so Roundup is everywhere, spraying the weeds down instead of cultivating, and of course that's brought us a whole new slew of problems with it. But it's generally still wheat country.
One of the things that strikes me about your story is you have kind of combined some innovative ideas, some new stuff out there, and you're willing to experiment and be on the cutting edge. But also, you're willing to look back at some older concepts and some older ideas that maybe we bypassed when the chemical age came and monocropping became dominant and all that. One of the things I'm really interested in is you're working with this ancient variety of wheat.
Kamut, yes, Kamut.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit? What's the benefits to that wheat, and what was it that drew you to that, and why is that an important piece of this for you?
Well, actually, Kamut is a trademark. It's not the name of the grain.
Okay.
And I'll tell you how we stumbled onto that. I first had seen this ancient wheat when I was at county fair when I was probably a junior in high school. So this is now the early 60s, maybe 63 it was. Mm-hmm. And this old guy, he's probably younger than I am now, but he was passing out this grain by the handful, and he said, "Hey, Sonny," he said, "would you like some of King Tut's wheat?" And so I went over and he poured out this giant wheat into my hand. It was about 3 times the size of a regular wheat kernel that I was used to seeing. And it was quite a novelty. And the story was that there was a fellow from our county who was in the Air Force in Portugal. He went to the bar one night, and a fellow Air Force guy sitting next to him at the bar said, "Well, look what I got out of a tube in Egypt." And he dumped out a few kernels of this giant wheat on the bar. And the guy said, "Oh my gosh," he said, "my dad's a wheat farmer." He said, "Do you think I could send some of that home?" And he talked him out of 30 kernels or so. And he sent it home to his dad, and they all grew, which should have been the first clue. Probably it didn't come out of a tomb, 4,000 years ago.
Right.
But it was a great story, and everybody loved it, and that's what they told. And so this guy started growing it as a novelty, and he had, 4 or 5 or 6 years, he had about 500 bushel. But he didn't have a market for it, and it didn't make very good bread. It didn't make bread easily, it's say, because we later found out it was a very close relative of durum. But the pasta people also weren't very interested because the color wasn't quite as pristine as the newer varieties now. So he didn't have really any market for it, and he ended up feeding it to the pigs. This fellow, a friend and neighbor of his, had just grown it in his backyard as a novel and was passing it out. And I didn't really think anything more about it until I was at Davis finishing up my PhD in, oh gosh, it was 77, I guess. And I was eating a package of corn nuts one day, and on the back of it said corn nuts made with a giant corn. And I thought, oh, I wonder if corn nuts would be interested in giant wheat. So I called him up and I said, oh, wheat, yeah, we'd be interested in that. And so I called my dad and I said, Dad, see if we can find some of that old King Tut wheat. And he scoured around and he finally came up with about a pint jar, 2/3 full, out of a friend's basement. It'd been sitting there for 5 or 10 years, who knows how long.
Right.
This is about 14 years now after I'd first seen it. And he sent me a few tablespoons, and I sent it to Corn Nuts, and they did a little test. And I talked to them a few weeks later, and they said, "Wow, this is just fantastic. We'll take 10,000 pounds right now." And I said, "Oh well, I don't really have 10,000 pounds, but if you'll stick with me, I'll have that for you a very very short time." And 3 or 4 years, well, about 3 years, it took us to get up to 50 pounds. Mm-hmm. And I called him up again, and the guy I talked to was gone. No one was interested, so we just put it on the shelf. And there it sat until we went to our first national food show that I mentioned earlier in Anaheim, California. My dad and mom went with me and helped me with our booth that we were doing for Montana Flour and Grain, which we're selling stone ground flour mostly. And they wanted to show people this ancient wheat. And my dad showed it around to everybody that would stop. And at the end of the 3 days, my cousin and I had about, who knows how many, our pockets were full of business cards. And my dad had one interest in this ancient grain. One person came by, and because of that one person, we planted all 50 pounds in 1970 or 86. Now it was in the spring of 86, and 30 years later, Brian, that half acre that we planted from those 50 pounds had grown to 100,000 acres all over Montana, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, working with about 250 organic farmers. And 75% of it was going to Italy, where they're making over 3,000 different products. So it just blew up. We had no idea of the interest of this or anything. When we were first giving it out to friends, and my dad gave it to a lady who couldn't eat wheat. And she called back in a couple of days. She said, "What is this stuff? Because not only can I eat it, but I feel better now after I eat it." And so after that, then we looked at it completely different, more than just a novelty. And then it was the idea to register a trademark and sell it under a trademark, which made certain guarantees, just like any trademark is a guarantee to the customer you're getting certain promises. And our promises was that this grain was always 100% purely ancient wheat, never mixed with any modern wheats to make it cheaper from our side, but less healthy from the other side. That it had to be organically grown and certified organic, and that you had to tell the truth about it. You couldn't say more than what you knew through research or anything like that. Right. And so that's how we started with the trademark. And kamut is an ancient Egyptian word for wheat. And I wonder what the Egyptians really called it, because in those days we still thought it maybe came out of the tomb or from Egypt anyway. That didn't turn out to be true, but anyway, that's what we thought. And that's how we got started with it. It's just been an amazing ride. Mostly just with a good team we were able to put together and lots of support, and it's been great fun. It changed my whole concept of food. After that experience, I started looking at food as medicine instead of just, and focusing on quality rather than just quantity and growing as many bushels as possible, but rather growing food as nutritious as possible and as helpful as possible for people's health.
That's a really interesting story, and it sounds like, if I'm understanding right, it kind of your interest in it, or the interest in general, was, like you said, like as a novelty item, that it was this ancient, that it was larger than normal. But then, as you kind of followed through with this, you found out the nutritional benefits, I guess, gluten-free issue, that was something that could deal with, and some other nutritional benefits. Was that kind of where you?
Well, we can't say it does have gluten. In fact, it has more gluten than most wheat. Oh. But the gluten is so different from modern wheat, that for the 20% of the people who can't eat modern wheat because of gluten and other things that we don't even know about affect them in modern wheat, most all of those can have and eat this ancient grain with no trouble at all. So it's not gluten it's per se, it's the type of gluten. It's what we've done to change the gluten to make more bread with less wheat. And that's been the creation of all these other problems. And so we were able to short circuit all those by going back to wheat before they started with that, actually. And most people can eat it just fine, and not just eat it, but it helps them with other health problems. It's anti-inflammatory is what we found out. And most wheat causes inflammation at low levels, but this is highly anti-inflammatory.
So that really helped, like you said, that really helped launch your idea that maybe you had come from a background of wheat and maybe some of these other crops that were being raised in your area were a commodity going into the food system, but you really were connecting it to this is food, I guess it's a reminder, this is food that people eat.
That's right.
That they should be thriving on, that kind of thing, but that this really helped launch that idea for you, this one kind of wheat.
Well, wheat has built civilizations for thousands of years. The Babylonians, the Egyptians, Romans, parts of ancient China, ancient India. And then all of a sudden in this century or the last century in America, we can't eat it anymore. 20% of the people can't eat it anymore. You have to wonder what's going on. It's not, it can't be something that's thrived and helped build civilizations for thousands of years. Something else has happened. And what's happened is breeding programs focus only on high yields, either on the farm or in the mill or flour mill or in the bakery, have changed it to the point where people are having trouble digesting it.
It must have been a reminder for you of those peaches you saw way back when, how that was, they weren't developing that peach to be a good food. It was more like,
well, yeah, it was
the market.
Right. It was the industrialization of our food system. And when you focus only on industrialization, you're focusing on profits and the bottom line and quarterly reports and commodities. I mean, I was raised with that term, commodity everything, commodity reports, commodity markets, commodity everything. We never thought of as a wheat farmer growing food. We were growing commodities, and we haul them to the elevator, and the elevator manager would try to figure out some way to pay us less for that load of wheat we're about to dump in his pit. There was no thought of it as being food or appreciation for growing food for anybody. I mean, it was just a commodity that we were battling over for, what little pittance that the market was going to allow us. So that was a completely different mindset, which is an industrial mindset. And that's what's led to so many problems, I think, in our food system, is not thinking of agriculture and farmers as growing food, but growing commodities and producing and being part of the industrial system.
Well, farmers here in the upper Midwest can certainly identify with that, where corn and soybeans are the king commodities. And it's become such a system of just bulk commodity, the more the better, and not really looking at where does it fit into the whole food system. And we've paid the price.
And another problem with that, Brian, is the extractive nature of it. And I know that you folks have the same problem we do. It's all about extraction. So it's not about how to build a community or to build the Midwest or make farms more profitable or anything. It's all about extracting as much money as you can from these farmers through chemical inputs, through machinery inputs, through all kinds of inputs. Everything you need to farm now, or you're told you need, is taking almost all the money, in many cases more than what the value of the crop you're producing. And so it's just a vicious cycle. And no wonder we don't have time to think about food, because we're just trying to survive. And in our case, and probably not much different from where you are, half our neighbors that we had when I graduated from high school in the middle of the 60s are gone. Those farms are gone. And half of the main street, so we have in that town, Big Sandy was 1,000 in population when I graduated from high school. Now it's 600. Half the main street's boarded up. And that is the result of the extraction program of industrial agriculture.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's another thing I wanted to talk to you about. Was what I've been really struck by is, in all of this work that you've been doing, you really try to always make a connection between regenerative agriculture and the benefits it can have as far as the environment, soil, that kind of thing, but also, just as importantly, the connections to a healthy rural economy. And one of the things I know you talked about in your book
was you had looked at, I think it was, you had estimated that there were 12 farm families that had been replaced by the more industrialized system. And so one of your goals, one of your kind of gauges of success was, what can I be doing? What kind of agriculture can I be pursuing that will provide a livelihood for 12 families in this community? I think that's a super interesting gauge of success.
So that number came from the number of homesteads, original homesteads. And in our area, the homesteads were not 160 acres, they were 320 because they were desert claims. I mean, they already realized it didn't rain here like Iowa and where you guys are, and Minnesota and the upper Midwest. It doesn't rain enough to make a living on 160 acres, so that the homesteads were 320. So we were farming within probably 10 years when I got back. We were farming about 4,000 acres, and those made up of about 12 homesteads. And I thought, my gosh, we've replaced 12 families that started out here in this neighborhood. And Big Sandy was a thriving community of 1,800 people in the late teens, before it stopped raining in the early 20s and they started moving out. They started going broke. I thought, wouldn't it be cool to be able to support 12 families on the same land that supported 12 in the homestead era? So that was kind of where I got the numbers and the idea. And we did that by creating value-added activities that really were directly related to the farm. When we converted to organic, of course, that takes more time, and so we had to have a little more help. I was doing it myself and my dad part-time when we came back, and my wife a little bit, and then my kids, they got a little bit older. So we developed a 9-year rotation with, 8 or 10 or 12 different crops. There were about 5 or 6, 7 cash crops and 3 or 4 soil building crops that were grown for the soil, not for sale. So they went back into the ground to build up the soil. And those cash crops that we grew every other year became now more varied. And one of them was an oil seed. We grew high oleic safflower oil, which is very good for your heart. And so rather than just sell the seed, we created a business on the farm called the Oil Barn, and moved into our cattle barn because I didn't have my cows anymore because I was traveling in the winter. My wife said she wasn't going to feed those cows in the winter, and so they went down the road, and so now we had an empty cow barn. So we converted that to an oil production facility and got some oil presses, and we started selling high oleic, non-refined, cold pressed safflower oil. My first idea was to use it for a fuel. But I took it to one of my hired men took it to the restaurant. He said, wow, this makes the best French fries we've ever had. He said, we'll pay you $2 a pound for this. So when you figure out $2 a pound, how much, that's $16 a gallon. So it wasn't very easy to think that I should sell it as food instead of putting my tractor as fuel. And so we started selling it to restaurants. And we now supplied the University of Montana State University with all their cooking oil. We put it in bottles and sell it some retail. Had a very good market selling cosmetic companies because it's really good for your skin. And they're making all kinds of salves and creams and oils and things for that. That added 3 or 4 more employees. And then we got the oil back from the university, the used oil, and was able to clean it up and dewater it and filter it and put it in my tractor. So we got to sell it twice. So this big fight we have in this country, or a big argument we sometimes have about using good farmland to grow fuel. And so there's a fight versus food versus fuel, how we should use our land. Well, if you use it first for food, and then in this case, the leftover for fuel, you can solve both of those arguments with one solution. So if a farmer can sell some of his products twice, it really helps the bottom line. So that was one of the things that we were doing with our oil business. We started a snack business using that oil to fry our ancient wheat and make a fried snack, which was similar to corn nuts. No company had really picked that idea up, so I decided to do it myself. And so that company's still going. I've sold these companies now, but they're still going. But that hired another 3 or 4 people. And then we had our Kamut Enterprises located here in Big Sandy, our headquarters for that, and that hired 3 or 4 people. And so we're up to about a dozen families now that we were supporting off of our farm and related projects. Mm-hmm. So I made my goal before I sold out all those businesses. So that was kind of a cool achievement that I had fun and really enjoyed doing. When I did sell it, in most of the cases to my businesses, I sold to my employees so that they would remain here in the community. My employees left, the main ones left, and I didn't have that opportunity, so I sold it to a neighbor about 80 miles away. So it's still sort of in the region. So that was been my goal. I have lots of friends that I've made all over the country that build up businesses and then they like to cash out selling it to some big company and who ends up a lot of times closing down the business and it's a loss to the community, which I think is a shame. And you lose not only the heritage of that, the legacy of that business, but also the jobs and the contribution it was making to the community. So anyway, that was never my goal, just as you said, and my goal was to try to create a value and have that value stay here instead of just being, so it's not extractive, it's additive to the community. I have a big project in Montana now to try to, or by 2033, have 33% of every plate in the state filled with Montana raised food. Right now it's about 5%.
Yeah.
After World War II, it was close to 85 or something. It was a lot different than it is now. And of course, every farm had chickens and all this other stuff, and sold milk. We sold cream to the local stores and everything. But still, the point is that it's become, we sell our wheat goes out of state. Our cattle go out of state, they're fattened, and they bring back the beef. The wheat goes out of state to make bread, and they bring back the bread. I mean, this is completely backwards as far as a stable economy for the local rural America. It's of course the way the big guys are making all their money, and so they love it, and that's what the extraction is all about. But I think if people really start to buy into the idea of spending a little more for quality and for local and for going some of the stuff that they're spending on frivolously now, it would certainly help the whole system revitalize.
Yeah, well, we can certainly identify with that here in this region, that's for sure. North central Montana is obviously a lot different than, say, Minnesota or the upper Midwest in general. For one thing, you get less than half of the amount of precipitation we get here, different soils. You have even a different, I think, from what I can see, different infrastructure as far as transportation and marketing of food. You're less densely populated, that type of thing. But what are some of the things you've learned over the years from your experiences, both kind of the hits and the misses, that maybe you think could be applied to the Midwest or to other parts of the country who are looking to, like I said, kind of step off of that road of the commodity industrialized system, and both from the production end of it, but also from the marketing end of it and kind of the local food system end of it, that kind of thing? What are some things that maybe you've learned along the way that maybe could be applied?
Well, that's a good question, Brian. And one of the things, if farmers could be paid like pharmacists are paid for the pills they sell, because they're producing something that is healing, what is the matter with that picture?
Yeah.
And we could certainly sell food for less than pills, but way more than the commodity market pays farmers, and reduce the cost of health care, and everybody wins. So where do you start with a thing like that? Well, I think that where you start is the people who need it the worst, and those are the people, the elderly population. So we're working with the senior centers that feed people, and the schools. Then the growing population, the youth, the children. They're in their formative years. They need nutrition worse than anybody to develop good minds and brains and good strong bodies and all this stuff. And you look at the chronic diseases in the schools now, it's just pathetic, and it's getting worse. So I think that we can find a interested party within those fields just by pointing out the trouble they have with attention spans and all this other stuff. A lot of that is all related to diet and what they're eating. Yeah. So we are starting with our little school, and as I told you, in Big Sandy, it's only a school is less than, 150 or so, but with the hot lunch program, and there's a group that started providing cull cows. I said, don't call them cow cows, call them grass-fed beef, because they're just coming off the range in the summer, in the fall, and they're open. They're not pregnant. there's nothing the matter with them, and they're really in pretty good condition after being on grass all summer, and they really produce great hamburger, and that's what they're going for. Mm-hmm. And so, we in America, at least in this garden, I'm sure it's the same in your area, meat and potatoes go together, right? So we planted potatoes. We have a dryland organic potato patch that we're planting. We planted in enough potatoes to feed the school. And we had the school kids come out. I had a friend from a couple hundred miles away with a team of horses and a potato digger, and they dug the potatoes while the kids got to watch this team of horses, and they just were enamored. And then they went all around and picked up the potatoes and put them in crates for us, and I put them in our root cellar. And we had to take them to town every month. We take in a few 100 pounds of potatoes every month to the school. But the kids now get a chance to be part of the harvest. And now when they eat those potatoes, it's part of what they participated in. And there's such an ownership there and an excitement that it's easy to sell. And now we're providing the school. We got them hooked up with the Ohio Lake safflower oil. Now, this oil is a lot more expensive than the cheap oil. But guess what? They were using the cheap oil once and throwing it away because it's cheap and it doesn't hold up. It doesn't last. This Ohio Lake safflower oil, and same thing with Ohio Lake sunflower. I know you grow sunflowers in your area. Maybe you don't grow many safflowers. But the sunflower oil would be the same thing if it's Ohio Lake. It's very good for high temperature cooking. And they're going to see if they can use that oil through the whole rest of the seasons for 6 months. And so even though it's way more expensive to buy, it's way cheaper in the long run because they're not throwing it away. And then I told them I'd like that waste oil, or well, we call it used oil. Don't call it waste because I don't want to be a waste handler.
Right.
So we can bring that used oil back to the farm and show people how we can turn it into fuel for our tractors. So we're starting with that. We're going to put get a flour mill to put in the kitchen because it's starting to be understood the value of fresh ground whole grains. And I know you grow whole grains there that you can eat, but if you grind them fresh and eat them freshly ground, all that nutrition that's bound up in that seed is available to who's ever eating it. And when you break that kernel and make flour, it doesn't all happen at once, but there's a slow disintegration of the nutrition of that flour over time. And so, and the other thing is, especially with wheat, we mostly eat white flour, and that stuff is, they throw away a third of the best nutrition that the wheat kernel has to offer. So we're working with grains that can produce whole grain flours that are palatable and the kids can enjoy and taste good. And so that's the kind of thing that we're starting with. We also do the snack food, and if you can do a snack with stuff that you grow there locally, you can do corn snacks and all kinds of stuff. You don't have to sell it to the industry. You can do stuff that adds value and nutrition and is fun to eat. So those are the kinds of things we're trying to do here that I'm hoping can be copied all over the country in their own way. Everybody has their own specialty and the things they can grow. Take what you can do and add value to it and add fun to it and put it in the marketplace.
I think that's really exciting. The connecting the food density and the food, reminding folks that you can raise food for consumption, kind of thing. And what's also gotten people excited in this area, and it sounds like maybe in your area as well, as far as farmers are concerned, is the connection to soil health. That has become a big way where farmers start out with trying to build their soil health. Maybe they're not happy with some of what their conventional systems, the impact it's having on soil. Then they go from A to B to C, and pretty soon they're really looking at how can I raise a product that's really nutritional and is kind of good, not just for the soil, but for the people who are consuming it, that type of thing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that is such a key. And you can go backwards from that too. If your goal is to produce food that heals, then you've got to have high nutrition in that field food. And the only way you get that is have living soils and soil health that is really producing and supporting that kind of food production. And you don't get that with industrial model, and they don't care. They don't look at it because it isn't there, and they're not paying the farmer for it anyway. They don't want to pay him anything extra. But if we would focus on food as medicine, is what I said, that means that there has to be high nutrition. The only way you can get that is highly living and good soils. that are full of life and vitality. And it's the very same thing that you were talking about. So you have to have that without that part being in the equation, it's not going to work.
Yeah.
So it naturally goes together. And that's what people have to think about. If they think about growing good food, then they have to know that they have to have good soil. I really think this is the future of agriculture, because the future we see right now is no future at all, except for very few survivors that that are going to be isolated mega farms in the middle of an otherwise empty landscape, because
Yeah.
everybody else has gone broke and gone. I don't
Yeah.
think that's the future we want.
For more on how community food systems based on our diversified agriculture can support rural economies while building soil health, see the podcast page for Ear to the Ground episode 361 at landstewardshipproject.org. If you have comments or suggestions about this podcast, contact Brian DeVore at bdevore at landstewardshipproject.org, or you can call 612-816-9342. It helps us greatly if you can give Ear to the Ground a rating on whatever podcast platform you utilize. And word of mouth is the best way to spread the news about our podcast. If you like what you hear, tell at least one person about LSP's Ear to the Ground. Thanks to Laura Morgendale, a Western Minnesota musician, for Ear to the Ground's theme music. And a special thank you to all of Land Stewardship Project's members who make initiatives such as this podcast possible. If you're not a member, visit landstewardshipproject.org to learn how you can support LSP. Thanks for listening.